What's up, guys? Logan Lewis. Strength coaches really annoy me because one of the cool things about bodybuilding is it's not really gate kept anymore, but strength training, for whatever reason, does really seem to be gate kept. And so I wanted to talk about how to make strength training easy and, if you're really smart, how to get the most out of it. So, one of the biggest tools that we're going to talk about is velocity based training, which kind of sounds complicated, but it's actually really simple. Most strength coaches don't use it because most strength coaches today are like most bodybuilding coaches 20 years ago, and they're kind of just guessing and using what worked for them rather than trying to figure out what works best. So, first of all, something that really annoys the anti science based training community is the term fatigue management, which I get because when it comes to bodybuilding or physique training, it's way more idiot proof. And fatigue management, while yes, is still important, it's not something that you need to worry about nearly as much. But when it comes to strength training, performance in ways that you probably haven't even thought of is way more important. And I don't just mean can you get the weight up that you need to get up today, but can you get it up at relatively the same speed that you got it last time? Can you get it up with good technique without form breaking down, stuff like that, hitting depth on squat, fully locking out your deadlift, all that good stuff, right? If you are hitting your top single and last week you hit that same single, but it was like 20% easier, then you've actually underperformed today. And we're going to talk about that when we get into the velocity-based training. So first of all, when it comes to fatigue management, it is always better to start your programs with a low estimation of how many sets per muscle group you should be doing. And it's also really important to remember that your priority is strength. If you're training for strength, then that's your priority. So if your accessory movements or if your hypertrophy movements are getting in the way of you being able to recover and perform at your highest level, then you got to back that stuff off. But again, physique training is kind of idiot proof. Thankfully, you can do very few really intense sets, or you can do a whole bunch of really intense sets, still get a fantastic stimulus by playing it kind of minimalistically. So when you start trying to build a program, or if you're following a program, or if you're just kind of winging it, you need to prioritize the strength movements. So easy rule of thumb is whatever movements or whatever muscle group you're trying to make super strong, you should be doing at least 5 to 10 sets of that per week. And we'll talk about how those should be set up and what they should look like here in a minute. Aside from that, when it comes to your accessory movements, start on the really low end. So if you're doing accessory movements, then I usually like to think of that as muscle groups, not movement patterns or exercise specific. So I'm going to say per muscle group, I would start with like 8 to 10 sets per muscle group that you think needs to be focused on per week. And when I say that you think needs to be focused on, because every single set that you do, it's going to damage the tissues that you're training, and it's going to take away resources from recovery and adaptation, which is fine. That's the whole point of it. You've got to break shit down and stress shit out if you want it to grow. But if you're doing it so much that you can't recover in a manner that allows your body and motivates your body to put forth peak performance next time you need to, you're training too much, right? So start minimalistically, measure your top sets, measure your performance, and if you can't perform at the same or better level week after week on the movements that you're prioritizing, you're doing too much. And the first thing that you need to cut away is accessory volume, especially if you're prioritizing strength. Even in strength training, sometimes we're going to prioritize hypertrophy because a bigger muscle is a stronger muscle. And if all your muscles are really small, but you're still really strong, that might be the number one thing to focus on. But we'll talk about that in a different video. So be minimalistic when it comes to your accessories. Now, how do you set up your sets for strength training? So this is where we're going to talk about velocity-based training. And here's what I'm going to say. Coaches that want to make themselves sound or feel really smart, which I totally get because it's pretty cool to feel really smart. They love to do percentage-based training, which is fine, but it's kind of unnecessarily controlled, and it's definitely, it's too rigid and it's too strict unless you're in a peaking block getting ready for some sort of show of performance, or if you're getting ready for a powerlifting meet or strongman comp, whatever it is. They'll use percentage of load to prescribe the difficulty of the set. That's fine, but let's say you go into the gym and it's week 3 of a 6-week block, and you're supposed to hit 85% 1RM for a double. Last week you hit that. Let's say you hit 80% of 1RM for a double, and it was pretty tough, right? Let's say it was like an RP 8.5 or 9, right? You maybe had a little bit more in the tank. Well, you'd go to hit 85% for a double this week, and it flew easier than last week's double at a lighter weight. Well, it would not make sense for the progression of the block if you cut it there. Because to be honest, what we're really looking for is a certain intensity, not a certain load to be moved. That makes no sense. That's an arbitrary measurement to roll with. So what we can do instead is we can still play around with the percentage of 1RM for your prescription, but instead of being too rigid with that, what I like to do is go off of velocity-based training, right? So when it comes to your top sets, typically we're just trying to progress the load, right? Except for the last week or two, we don't really care about how intense it is most of the time. Like I said, if we're peaking, that's a little bit different. When it comes to your working sets, though, honestly, what we're looking for is a certain difficulty, not necessarily a certain load. Now, if you, again, are underperforming, that's a whole different topic. But let's say you go into the gym and you're supposed to hit 3 reps of 75% 1RM, and your coach is thinking, or you're thinking that's going to be like an RP 6, right? It's going to be a little challenging, but honestly, it's going to fly. You get in there and it was like an RP 4 or 5. So it flew, but it really flew. So you hit those 3 reps, and let's say it's bench press, right? You hit those 3 reps, you're holding the lockout at the top of the third. Well, if it was that easy, there's no reason to stop there. If it was that easy, then what you're going to notice is that the speed of that last rep that you just did is probably really comparable to the speed of the first rep that you did. So here's where velocity-based training comes in, right? What we have observed when trying to find optimizations for strength training is that in a set, if you push past approximately 25% to 30% of a drop off in velocity from your first rep to your last rep, then the sets start to become less effective. Even if you don't control for rest times and you allow for a bunch of rest time, the sets start to become less effective. And that's because in strength training, volume is a little bit more of a driver, volume measured as reps, not set volume. So if you did 20 sets of 1 rep, that would be just as effective as doing 5 sets of 4 reps for strength training. What you're trying to do, what strength means, is you're trying to move a certain load, but if you continue to move the same load, but it gets faster and faster, you're still getting stronger because you're improving your power or your ability to produce velocity. So in strength training, instead, what I will do with athletes is I will say, okay, you're going to hit, and first, if it's the first time the athlete's working with me, we have to establish a baseline. So I'll be a little bit more controlled, and I'll want to get an idea of course, what are their 1RMs. But if I have that information, then what I'm going to do is instead of prescribing a percent and a specific rep range, I want them to get the most out of every set as possible without going too far. So I don't do RPE, I don't do a rigid rep number, I actually use rep ranges, and then I may prescribe a certain load. All right, so let's say it's week 3 and we're looking at working sets. What that's going to look like prescription-wise, they've hit their top set, if they even have a top set. They've hit their top set. Now they're doing their back downs, their working sets. I'm going to say, okay, I want you to load up the bar with 85% of your 1RM, and I want you to continue to perform reps until you feel like the rep you just did, it's about 25 to 30% slower than the first rep that you did. That lets you get as much benefit from the set as possible without pushing too far. So you save way more time because we're not going to break that up into a bunch of singles, but you stop the set exactly when it is the most effective. I like sounding really smart. because I pride myself on trying to be really smart. But at the end of the day, if you get too rigid, if you or your coach is trying to control too much, and you're only doing, we're doing a triple and you're doing it at this percentage of 1 RM, and we're not going to make an adjustment until I see you log what that is and you rate the RPE, and then next week, maybe we adjust it a little bit if it didn't turn out to be what I expected. That's great, but you waste a little bit of time each session because you don't allow yourself to be as precise as possible. Let yourself or let your athlete feel out the lift a little bit, right? If you're having trouble, if you're doing deadlifts, that's a lot to focus on, right? Especially if you're getting heavy, that's a lot to focus on. So if you're having trouble auto-regulating or trying to figure out what that velocity feels like, take videos and compare. After like 2 or 3 weeks, I've worked with people that have never lifted in their lives, and within 3 weeks, they can gauge the velocity of the sets really, really well. I work with the current world record holder for deadlifts. Within a week, he could gauge his own velocity really, really well. In fact, that's what we did to take his deadlift up like 200 pounds over 6 months, is we just switched to velocity-based training. And what he was used to is he would go in with super strict percentage 1 RM, this many reps, tell me what you would rate the RPE. Or sometimes coaches will have equations built in to their spreadsheets. But again, it wastes time and it's not actually as precise as it could be. So when you go in there, the way that you're going to gauge your sets is based on velocity. Keep pushing the set, if it's a working set, until the last rep that you do. 25-30% slower than the first rep. You do that and you will make sure that every set you do leaves nothing on the table, and every set you do doesn't push you too far. Obviously, if we're doing tertiary stuff or technique work, that goes out the window, but I wouldn't really call those working sets. If we're doing top singles, that's not really what we're looking for. But easiest rule of thumb for your working sets, for the sets where you're not trying to test anything, you're not trying to work on technique, the sets where your main goal is to get stronger, all you're going to do is you're going to make sure it's less than 6 reps, load up the bar with whatever weight needs to be in order for you to get, at least 1 rep, but not more than 6. Keep performing reps. You do a rep and you're like, that felt about 25-30% slower than my first one. Call it there. Watch the video, see if you were right. If you were, great. You know what that feels like. You're accurate with it. You can auto-regulate that from now on. You don't waste time. You don't waste gains. You don't waste effort. And you maximize the potential of getting strong as hell.